Gregor Mendel had this idea that independent assortment was that if we're talking about the height of pea plant, that the height of the pea plant has no influence on the color of the peas. The color of the flower has no input, input I think is fine, on whether the peas were wrinkled or round. Okay, so they're independent of each other. But what happens when we want to look at the probability of two traits and the combination of two traits? They are independent of one another, but each one is independently kind of recombining to give us certain traits. So what we have on the top of your sheet, we also wrote on the board. So we have two traits. It doesn't matter what the traits are. It's T's and Q's. Who cares what they are? The idea is, what are all the possible combinations that we can get? Independent assortment says that your T's are independent of your Q's are independent of your T's, and they have no bearing on each other. So we have, what this is really looking at, for like example, this third one, what this is this is a big T, little t trait, and a big Q, little q trait. They're two different traits that individual has heterozygous for T and they're heterozygous for Q. So the idea is during the production of sex cells where those alleles separate, that's why we do Punnett squares, what could get passed on? So we're going to start with the third one and we're going to kind of work up. And you can say why, hopefully we'll see it in a second. So what are all the possible T and Q combinations we could get? Well, you can say T and Q. Yeah, I know, but big T's, big Q's, little Q's. And what this is really, it's kind of like a math problem. It's kind of a distribution thing. So what could the big T combine with? A big Q. Or the big T could combine with a little q. Okay? So this individual could produce a sex cell with a big T, big Q, or they could produce a big T, little q. That big T is independent of the Q's. Okay? What about the little t's? The little t could combine with the, or it could combine with the little q. So we have four different letter combinations that we could get. We could get a big T, big Q, a big T, little q, a little t, big Q, or a little t, little q. Okay, those are all the possible combinations that we could get. Now, what about if we go up one? Now we have big T, big Q, little q. What about the big T? The big T could combine with, the first big T could combine with the big Q, and the first big T could combine with the little q. Now, I added two blanks. You don't have those blanks, but I put them there just for kind of illustration purposes. That's what the big T, the first big T could be. What could the second big T come up with for possibilities? The exact same thing. So are there really four different combinations? The answer is, well, there's four combinations. However, two of the four are the same. So we have two unique combinations. Okay? So that's why I put those blanks there as kind of like placeholders. Like technically it is a big T, big Q, big T, little q, but it's still 50% of the time is going to be a big T, big Q. 50% of the time is going to be a big T, little q. What about the big T, little q? Big T, big little q. How many different unique combinations can we get? One. And it's going to be a big T, little q, right? That's all the possible combinations. Now, technically, we would like do the distribution thing, but they all would be genetically identical to one another. So if an individual is homozygous for two different traits, they can only pass on the big T, because that's all they have, and they can only pass on a little q, because that's all they have. Okay, but that's the idea that during meiosis, those alleles separate, and they're separate and independent of one another. Okay, so this is this idea that we can go through and we can use. So we could go through, and we're going to kind of continue, and there's a whole lot of traits that we're going to reference, kind of some, I cut this packet at page 2 when there was really a page 3 and a 4. So some of these we aren't going to use. But anytime they're talking about a certain trait, we kind of want to reference back to page 1 with this chart. Okay, so the idea of this is we can do Punnett squares that deal with 2 traits. And there's 2 methods that you can do this. And we're going to show you both methods. I have a pretty good guess as to which one you're going to like. Let's just do it here. I have a pretty good idea of which one you're going to like better. But I'll show you both. So if we were to go big B, little b, big E, little e, and we cross that with a big B, little b, big E, little e, oops, wrong one. That is commonly referred to as a dihybrid cross. Di, 2 traits, hybrid meaning heterozygous. So they're heterozygous for 2 different traits. But does the B influence the E's? No, it doesn't. Good, it doesn't. So I'll show you the way that I think you're probably going to lean, but we'll show you the other option as well. So if this is what the parents are. Okay, they have big B, little b, big E, little e. That's one parent. And the other parent is big B, little b, big E, little e. And what is B's? Big B's is brown hair and blonde hair, and little E's are brown eyes versus blue eyes. Okay, so we're talking about hair color and eye color. The way I like to treat these is I like to look at one trait and one trait only, because that's really what we're talking about. I'm only going to look at the B's. So because we're good at these, hopefully we're good at these at this point. We take a big B, little b, and we cross it with a big B, little b. Because that's the only thing is that black? Thank you. That's the only thing we care about when we talk about the hair color, because the hair color has nothing to do with the eye color. Then I look at the eye color, and I look at only the eye color traits, and that's a big E, little e, cross with a big E, little e. Now the idea is, what are the possible combinations that we could get? And when we do a Punnett square, now actually Mr. Board, we will do that piece. Yeah. Because we will do a 4x4, just to show it. That when we go through and we do a 2x2 Punnett square, shouldn't be, hopefully, too much of an issue. Okay? Big B, little b, cross with a big B, little b. This is what we get in terms of a Punnett square. And when we do a big E, little e, and we cross that with a big E, little e, we get a Punnett square that looks something like that. Okay? Now what we can do is we can go through and we can look at this and we can say, if big B represents brown hair and little b represents blonde hair, what would this offspring be? Brown or blonde? What about this one? And what about this one? And what about this one? Okay, so what fraction are going to be brown hair? 3 out of 4. And what fraction are going to be blonde? 1 out of 4. Good. Now, if big E is brown eyes, little e is blue eyes, brown eyes, brown eyes, brown eyes, 3/4, blue eyes, 1/4. And then we can say, well, what are the possible combinations of having a brown-haired, blue-eyed kid? Now, the other way we can do this, and we'll look at it kind of all together, is we go back to that third one up top, and we say, what is all the possible combination of B's and E's that we could get? And that's the whole things like that. So there are 4 different possibilities. We could go big B, big E, we could go big B, little e, we could go little e, B, big E, or we could go little b, little e. So these are the 4 possible combinations that one parent could have. And then the other parent, because they're exactly the same, would have the exact same possible combinations. So then what we can do is we can do a Punnett square with these 4 possible traits, where this big B, big E would go here, this big B, little e would go here, this little e, little b, big E, and this would go here. And that'd be like for mom. And because dad is exactly big B, little b, big E, little e, could do the exact same thing on the top. And then we fill in a Punnett square. It's just our Punnett square is 4 by 4 instead of 2 by 2. I'm showing you 2 options here, just for the record. I'm guessing you're going to lean towards the one that I showed first, but then we can go through and we can fill that in. And filling it in is nothing different than what we did here, except for we put our B's together and we put our E's together. So we're going to have 4 letters in each box. Okay? So that's that idea. And then when we go through, there's 16 different outcomes, 4 by 4, 16 different outcomes that we could get here. And the 16 different outcomes that we get give us a probability. Fractions are good. And we can look at how many are going to be brown-haired and brown-eyed. We can look at how many are brown and blue-eyed, how many are blonde-haired brown eyes, and how many blonde-haired blue eyes. And both these methods get us the exact same probabilities. I personally like this one better, personally, because this is something that we've already kind of done, and we've done it a bunch of times. So on my Punnett square over here, I have big B's and little b's, and we kind of already went through and we said brown hair. Of my brown hairs, we have 3 out of my 4 are going to be brown hair. And of my 4 boxes, I have 1/4 that are going to be blonde. Okay. Now we can go over here and we could do the same thing. And we could say, well, how many are going to be brown? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12? I think 12. 12 out of 16 are going to be brown hair. Okay? Now, if we reduce that fraction, what's 12/16 and reduce 3/4, which, hey, look, that's the same probability that I came up with, right? And then if we go through and in our black marker, we kind of put little scribble lines for any little b, little b, little b, little b's, and we look and say, hey, look, there's 4 out of 16, which is the same as saying, hey, look, 1/4 are going to be blonde according to that, right? So we have 4. Okay. Then we come over here and we look at my hair color, eye color, and I can say 1, 2. I should use. I can go through and say how many are going to be brown eyes. 3 out of 4 are going to be brown. And then I can go through and I can look at, I could look at this and say, well, 1/4 of these are going to be blue. Which, if we go over there and we count them, would be the same idea. Okay? But the question that we can do with these versus this is we can say, well, what's the probability that, and that's what these questions down here are getting to. What are the probability that we're going to have brown hair and brown eyes? So on Mr. DeBoer's, he's looking for anything that has a big B and a big E. Okay? And if he goes through and counts them all up, he's going to get some number. The way I suggest doing it is with the 2 pedigrees, or the 2 Punnett squares, is I look at mine because this is a whole lot easier to look at and less likely to make a silly mistake. And I say, well, what's the probability that I'm going to get brown hair? Out of my hair color one, I get 3/4, right? So 3/4 of the offspring are going to have brown hair. Of my eye color one, what's the probability that I'm going to get brown eyes? 3/4. Okay? Now, this is called like the product rule, and we have to multiply some fractions together. Now, when we multiply fractions, we multiply the numerators, the numbers on top, we multiply the denominators, the numbers on the bottom, and we put them in the same spot. So 3 times 3, we multiply the numerators, 3 times 3, we get 9 for a numerator. Multiply the 4's on the bottom, 4 times 4, we get 9 out of 16. 9/16. Now Mr. DeBoer went through and counted his on his giant one, and of the 16 boxes, he had 9 that are big B something, big E something. Okay, he had 9 out of 16. I got the same probability that he did. Okay? Then we can move on to brown hair, blue eyes. Well, what's the probability I'm going to get brown hair? 3/4. What about blue eyes now? 1/4. What's 3/4 times 1/4? 3/16. So now, if Mr. DeBoer were to go through and count how many are big B something littlies, he would get 3 out of his 19. Okay, there's 3 of them. And you gotta kind of hunt because it gets a little bit in there. But there are bottom, second one, yep, right there. Okay, so it's there. What about blonde hair, brown eyes? Well, what's blonde hair? 1/4. What's brown eyes? 3/4. So then we get 3/16 probability that we're going to get blonde versus blonde and brown. And what about blonde and blue? Recessive. It's 1/4 times 1/4 to get 1/16. Okay, so doing a little bit of math, some multiplication of some fractions, it should be that way. We can go through and we can get probabilities. Or if you want, there's nothing wrong with doing what we did on the board, that 4x4. You have to come up with all the possible letter combinations, and then you have to go through and do a 4x4 Punnett Square, and then you got to search through them and look at the combination of B's and E's and which one gives you the results you want. Both of them ultimately will give you the same probabilities. I think this way better method, just from the standpoint of you're good with 2x2 Punnett Squares, and we got to do a little bit of math. We got to multiply some fractions together.
Unlike that one, bigger and more math.
Bigger, you got to come up with all the possible combinations. It's easy to make a mistake along the way. So we'll talk about this a little bit more tomorrow, and then we'll kind of wrap this up. We're testing on Friday.